Hello, everyone. I'm here with Tristan Johnson. Tristan, how are you doing?
Not bad, not bad. It's Monday night, and I am not on bedtime duty, so I feel pretty good.
There we go. I think that's the most important thing. Making you can have the evening to yourself. I guess to talk with me, but yes. Tristan, for anyone else, who doesn't know, is a content creator. He has a YouTube channel. Started a YouTube channel called Step Back History Channel. And maybe Tristan, do you want to kind of give a little bit of a introduction for what made you interested in starting this channel that explores a lot about U.S. history and maybe North American history, kind of history and in politics, and yeah, what made you interested in this and doing the other content work that you do?
Sure. The my first attempt, I remember I made a video where I filmed somebody beatboxing on YouTube in 2007 when I was like, probably like 18 years old or something. And I've been always trying to take a stab at you. I've been fascinated by YouTube as a platform basically like since then. So pretty much since the beginning. But my primary thing, the reason I started Step Back specifically was because I have, I'd done a bunch of just kind of random things before, and I started Step Back about 10 years ago, it'll be 10 years this September, with the idea of having a more intentional strategy towards what I make and having everything a little bit more branded, because YouTube in the early days was much more of a social media platform than it is now. But I have an even longer history. Like, I've been politically active pretty much since, I would say probably since like 2002, 2003, when I was in high school. I got really into, or I got kind of activated by the Iraq War and the sort of post 9/11 war on terror period. And that combined with just, I grew up in a family that has a lot of interest in history. I've seen a lot of historical sites and road tripped around the U.S. quite a lot when I was young. So it all kind of amalgamated in me taking a real interest in history. And that combined with like the sort of justice angle, I over time just really knew that was a direction to go down. And after some other attempts at other things, I did a degree in history that I finished in 2013. And then I did a master's in American Cultural Studies that I finished in 2014. And then I did a master's in history that I finished in 2015. And so I actually started Step Back in September as I was starting a PhD program. And originally it was just sort of like YouTube in 2015 had worked very differently than it does today. And so it was very much like the high watermark of like the CGP Grey style 5-minute explainer video. And so I was doing that, but then 2016 came around and I realized that it was not really going to make a whole lot of sense to just kind of sit by the sidelines and do education, like random educational stuff, when I know the stuff I'm talking about has real world impact and real like gravitas. And I had been, I had done that in like my teaching, like as a TA and stuff like that, but I hadn't done it on YouTube, and I kind of started to step up. And that was around the same time that several other, kind of sort of a wave of left-wing content creators started to really appear on the platform and take off. And many of them were like colleagues and friends of mine. And so I kind of followed in their footsteps and their best practices. And then I kind of kept that going until today. And I for a while anyway, from like 2019 to 2024, I was a full-time content creator, and I'm not anymore. I miss it. I miss it a hell of a lot. But that's sort of like the real quick and dirty like answer of like how I ended up doing what I was doing. Is just, it was like an evolution of one thing in front of the other, based on the things that inspired me and activated me just as a person.
That makes total sense. I have often found that too. Most things in life it's like one step after the other. It's always based off of the previous thing. And I think one takeaway I have from this is I think you and I are officially about the same age, if I'm doing the math correctly, because I was also about 17 and 18 in uh, 2007. The I guess one thing I'm super curious about. I mean, as someone you've done a lot of historical analysis of the alt-right in the United States, and you've also done a lot of analysis of different societal issues impacting United States, maybe North America more generally. What do you think of the current situation and what's been happening in the United States? I guess we're recording this in the summer of 2025, so and with under the second Trump presidency.
Yeah, that is. I think that if you can actually answer that, there's like a decent award, history award in there for you. But the main things that I have to say is like, as a historian, the things that I'm taking away are that there's a lot of narrative, especially in sort of a more liberal interpretation of current events, that treats this as some kind of novel breakdown, this sort of like new series of events. But if you have a historical memory that goes beyond, goes earlier than 2016, you can see the precedents of the moment that we're in that are way deeper in the sort of American experience and the sort of history of the United States and the last like century or so. Like, one of the things I always think is really interesting is that Donald Trump as a president seems to actually like he governs a lot. I like one of my friends, my former PhD supervisor. He is a historian of like late 19th century America, and it came out to me. He's like, this guy like he governs a lot like Teddy Roosevelt, and he is trying to, I think, channel that sort of late 19th century presidency, mostly because that was like just when like the presidency was not as powerful as it is today, but had a lot more. Was like diplomacy back then was a lot more like interpersonal rather than like large institutions with like deliberating and decision making bodies and stuff. But I think that like, so you could like see it on the long scale of American history. If you want like the 150-year story, it is a explicit moving away from the United States as sort of a modern, organized, like bureaucratic state. Like, you can see the sort of trend line in the United States in the last like century of it joining the rest of the countries in the world and becoming more strengthening institutions and becoming like stronger bureaucratic states that have like services and welfare and like all sorts of like just the things that a lot of modern countries have, and now that we take for granted. And now a explicit attempt to move away from that to something that honestly, and on top of like kind of putting aside great power politics and moving towards like, instead of like a sort of American post-Cold War hegemony, moving towards a multipolar global situation, a lot of it feels like we're moving towards a like new Victorian age and all of the horrors that entails. So that's like the really, really like longue durée version of it, is that we're kind of moving into a new global norm that really hasn't existed since basically since the First World War. And that means that like we're coming out of like a long period where like there were rules to the international order. There were like you weren't allowed like after World War I, we made a whole bunch of like ground rules for the world about how you can declare how war can be played out, how diplomacy is to be done, that like things have to be done on the global stage, and like that seems to be dissolving rather fast. The other one is that Donald Trump also represents the sort of end of a long history of the last crisis of capitalism and the response to it. So there was a time that's not very different from how things are now, which was in the 1920s, where there was like extreme wealth inequality, but nothing close to what we have today. And then there was the great market crash of 1929 and the depression of the 1930s, which was then responded to by following economic wisdom that paired out really well, which was, Keynesian economics, because basically to be an alternative to, Soviet-style communism, they decided to adopt a little bit of planned economy, and they added like a bunch of stuff where they would use the state's power to invigorate the economy a little bit, and then kind of still keep the market system, but keep it within bounds. And that has also been a lot of like the sort of Western world's, state. Like some countries, to more or less degrees, have free markets that are then constrained by welfare states, by taxation, like progressive taxation, and programs meant to blunt the sort of brutal edge of this system that's designed to, at its core, funnel money away from people and then shove it to like the hands of a few people. And I think that a lot of Americans lost the plot and realized that this was a explicit post-World War II, almost like bargain made with workers. Like, you won't become communists, and we will let you unionize, have reduce income inequality, give good jobs, create good housing, that kind of thing, if you're white. And then that kind of bargain was what kept American stability in the mid-century. And you can trace almost perfectly the dissolution of American stability and the beginning of it sort of falling apart and leading towards today to the sort of right-wing attempt to dismantle that system. So you might have the first example of that might have been the Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964, where Barry Goldwater was a Republican candidate for president who had some very, very extreme right-wing views and was considered by the American people crazy. And Lyndon B. Johnson won with one of the largest majorities in American history. And the Republican presidents, the only Republican president after that was Nixon. And Nixon was very much a kind of conservative, but still fairly liberal. There's this sort of term that were called Rockefeller Republicans, because the Republican Party was a lot more they were a lot more liberal, and they had a sort of more conscientious, social justice forward idea towards it in it. And then with Reagan, the sort of that sort of part of the party got explicitly exiled, and the Democratic Party, because of their loss in 1984, on a sort of trying to really push a worker-focused, labor-focused, their bread and butter that had worked for them since FDR, they pushed that and they lost badly. And the lesson they learned is that basically they needed to jettison organized labor, they needed to jettison the sort of working class roots of the party, and you had what were called third wave or new wave Democrats. The probably most explicit version of this would be Bill Clinton's presidency in the 1990s. And this was the Democratic Party explicitly moving away from populist left-wing economics and moving towards finance and technology with a slightly socially progressive bent to it, although not always. And that became the sort of status quo. Things would have gotten a lot worse if it wasn't for the fact that the internet was invented around that time and caused a huge economic boom that sort of balanced it out. But during the Reagan administration and the following Clinton, or the Bush and then Clinton administration, you saw this period of strong deregulation of the finance sector, deregulation of the economy, and a move towards more and more free market economics. The general keyword to use here is neoliberalism. The ideology of neoliberalism basically became bipartisan consensus after the Cold War, which is this idea that basically free markets are superior to the government in every possible way, and if you can find a way to replace a function of the state with a function of the free market, then do it. And that has been continuously happening. And the more, for example, one of the bills that Bill Clinton put in place was an explicit repeal of something called the Glass-Steagall Act, And the Glass-Steagall Act was a bill put in by FDR during the Depression, which meant that, like, if you were the kind of bank that held people's bank accounts, a bank, or if you were an investment bank, those could not be the same company. So, like, a bank that made its money by investing in the stock market couldn't then also be the same kind of bank that held your money. So, so what happened was that basically banks were now able to invest in the stock market with people's life savings, because they were like, well, we have protections enough in place and everything is going so well that we're never going to have a bank, foreclose like it did in 1929 or 1930, where like a bank goes out of business and all of a sudden tons of people who had bank accounts there all of a sudden have no money. Because keeping trust in that institution is like key to like preserving faith in sort of economic system that keeps everything up. Anyways, I know I'm rambling, so I have to say, like, what happened is that as that kept getting dismantled, it led to more and more volatility in the economy, because capitalism by its very nature is a system that is prone to booms and crashes unless it is very strictly managed. And so you had the 2008 crash because a deregulated banking system was able to leverage toxic assets and then trade them around, which led to a whole lot of money that basically didn't exist in the economy pretending to be there. And ever since 2008, the entire economy has been held up by basically keeping interest rates unsustainably low. So everybody could borrow money infinite, especially like companies could borrow money virtually infinitely and burn through it with the hope that they could, become the monopoly, for example, Uber spending tons and tons of money to take over an entire industry and then jack up the prices once they have a monopoly, that kind of thing. But that plus like the disruptions caused by COVID and all that kind of stuff has led to the economy getting more and more unstable, which has led to more and more people being disillusioned with the capitalist system. But because, and this has to do, I think, a lot with the fact that the Democratic Party, and this is going to sound kind of quixotic, but when it comes to their the primaries and caucus system for when they're choosing their presidential candidates, the Republican Party is actually a lot more democratic in its, like, the people have more say over their primaries and caucuses than the Democratic Party does. And so when people realized that the sort of capitalist status quo wasn't working, the Republican Party's candidate that called that out, even though he was, lying through his teeth because he's the face of everything that's wrong with what's happening, but because, it's not exactly a party made up of people with good critical thinking skills, and because, he was able to channel that resentment that they really didn't have a name for, so they were blaming basically, people of color or LGBT people or whoever they wanted to blame. But he was able to leverage that sort of knowledge that everyone has that the way things are isn't going to work, and he leveraged it to power. And I think he would have been reelected in 2020 if it wasn't for his explicitly bad handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I really think that we're going to look back and see like the Biden administration kind of as like almost like a little blip or a mistake or something like that. Like it broke down over one specific weird thing. And in the Democratic Party, you had the exact same kind of anti-establishment, things are messed up, we need to do something, which was Bernie Sanders, who sort of inherited the Occupy Wall Street energy. And the Democratic Party pulled all of the stops imaginable to basically kill that insurgent campaign. And so while in 2016 and 2020, so the Democratic Party was making themselves basically the face of the economic status quo that wasn't serving anybody anymore by actively getting rid of the major voices of reform from within the party. Because the Democratic Party is not like in a sort of like not in the way that like Americans would conceive of it, but like they're a conservative party, and that they don't like change, and that they have like they believe very much in like seniority and like keeping leadership, like they believe very strongly in their own institutions, and they don't like seeing those get upended. They get very upset. While the Republican Party is a lot more ideological, and so Trump overthrowing basically the party, a lot of the people in that party were able to like, okay, I guess this is what we're doing now, and then they kind of just went along with it. So All that is to say is like you saw this, like there's this greater thing where like the sort of 20th century world order that was like a growing international rules-based world order is falling apart. Then the crisis of capitalism that kind of that started in the Depression, that then had a bunch of programs made to remediate all of the issues that they caused, then had those systematically dismantled over a period of like 4 or 5 decades. And then once you've done that, you then end up with a president who is basically like the representation of all of the rage against the system, but with none of the right targets by somebody who was just blatantly lying about what is all the problems. And you could say some other stuff like how the civil rights movement and the sort of like student activist protest era created a sort of norm around social justice and the progress of social justice that always had a growing resentment building in the reactionary right that has also been spending the last like 40 years dismantling all of the things that they fought for and putting themselves back in power, which is all basically like we're kind of seeing the backlash basically against desegregation essentially. Or just even a backlash against the Obama years and the sort of slight amount of social progress made with like Me Too and like Black Lives Matter and all that. So it's like a lot that you could play around with, but like in many ways, it's just a lot of the cycles. There's this, I think it was like Octavia Butler that said that like you can always guess what the crises of the future are going to be, because all you need to do is look at what the problems around you are right now that everyone are ignoring, and then give them 30 years until they become crises. And we are basically reaping the effects of pretty much everybody who had the power to do so, neglecting all of the things that they had put in place to prevent a crisis from happening after World War II, thinking that those were in the past. And now everyone's chickening on the roost in like the worst way possible. And now all of the worst off people are going to pay for the consequences, or got to pay the consequences for what, the wealthy in both political parties have basically set up for us.
Yeah.
So that was a really, really long answer.
No, but this makes total sense. It's a very helpful overview. It's a very helpful summary of what's going on the societal, like economic level at the big picture, and then how that's influencing the party. To say that you engage with this stuff